Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be doing a little bit of this and this to say hello to everybody in WebEx land, as well as the overwhelming crowd in our offices today. Thank you for those who did brave the elements and join us here today. My name is Megan Hennigan. I am the Deputy Director of Education here at JCO. I will be joined by Erin Lynch, who is an Associate Counsel here today. And our boss, Keith St. John, is in the crowd. He's the Director of Ethics, and I'm sure he will have some things to say as well during, perhaps, maybe. But we're ready if he does. So we really do enjoy putting these ethics forums on. I think we are a small community of folks in a very important area of the law, very heavily scrutinized right now. Ethics in government is really everywhere in national, state headlines, as you know, as well. So it's a good opportunity for us all to get together today. We're going to be talking about the limits that exist on engaging in political activity while at work. Get lots of questions on this, more so in the Public Officers Law 74 side, but we're going to talk about Civil Service Law 107 today and throw in some other areas as well. Again, getting together to educate you about what our perspective is on the interpretation of these laws and regulations, continue to provide ethics officers and general counsels a forum to discuss your questions with each other in the room. It's nice, like I said, to be able to get together and to stay apprised of inquiries that are going on across all of our agencies. With that, let's get started. And please stop me along the way if you have questions. There were not a lot of questions that came in, so we put in our own hypotheticals to help our discussion today. And I just want to have one more reminder for WebEx. Could you all, as much as possible, mute your microphones? That would be great. Thank you. All right. So first of all, these are the topics we're going to go over today. Talk about Civil Service Law 107, go over an overview, talk about the penalties, and some of our hypotheticals as well. We'll go through Public Officers Law 73 and 74, an overview and the penalties. We'll talk about the regulations, advisory opinions that have to do with political activities in 73 and 74, and some of our hypotheticals as well. And finally, we'll briefly at the end talk about some of the agency-specific rules that we're aware of, and maybe that would be a good place for us to talk about our best practices and the things we do in our agency. All right, we're going to start with Civil Service Law 107, which is known as the Little Hatch Act. Both federal and state laws restrict government employee involvement in political activities. And as most of us know, the Federal Hatch Act addresses political restrictions at the federal level. But on the state level, we have Civil Service Law, Section 107, the Little Hatch Act, which addresses political activity in the state workplace and puts rules in place about what we can and cannot do. When we're talking about political activity, what does this mean? So when we're talking about the prohibition against certain political activities and the improper influence, that's the title that's actually given in the statute. The political activity means doing something in active support or opposition to a political party, a candidate for partisan political office, or a partisan political group. There are 4 or 5 different sections of the law, and this is the first one. It talks about recommendations based on political affiliations. What does the law basically say? If you're involved in hiring potential employees, you cannot ask questions regarding a candidate's political affiliation, their contributions, or how an applicant voted in an election. It's also important to remember here that this also includes promotions or removals from the position as well. So any hiring or firing decisions generally. So we got together to plan this. We said, let's come up with some scenarios that in this area that it would be okay to ask about in situations like this, but ones then that will give the impermissible examples as well. So this could be a potential permissible way to ask your applicant questions. In an interview, you may be able to ask an applicant if they've held any positions of authority in any non-work-related organizations without, of course, digging right into, are you a party chairperson or something of similar. Impermissible would be something obvious, like, how did you support the governor in the last election? So we're not going to dig right into those blatantly direct political questions. Let me back up one more time here. We came up with a lot of examples on our own because there is not a lot of case law out there about 107. I don't know if any of you have ever had to look anything up. I could say maybe 20, not even 20 cases. So it was interesting to be researching this area. One we did pick to talk about, and most all of them were on the municipal level. So again, it was hard to, there really weren't many at the state level. There's a case, Richardson versus City of Saratoga Springs, and if you're interested, the site is 246 82nd 900. So in this example, the employee was an electrician. He was employed by the city, and he had a lawsuit against the city. He had been wearing a political button of his office's political opponent, and he was in a supervising position. The trial court said he did not present enough evidence to establish that there was a link between, he didn't get certain promotions, people who had less experience than him were promoted over him. And that, so the appellate court reversed that, and the trial court's judgment, they said that employee satisfied the burden of coming forth and that he did have admissible proof that he was being treated detrimentally by having his job duties adjusted in a way that was calculated and did lead to being denied a promotion because of his off-duty political activities. So his petition was reinstated and went. So, I mean, you can imagine this could happen at any level of government. So I thought that was just a really good, easy to understand example of how that section actually came through in practice. The next section is regarding inquiries regarding political affiliations. You may not be questioned directly or indirectly about your political affiliation as a condition of employment. An interesting exception written right into the law, you can ask about a person's membership in an organization that advocates overthrowing the United States government or other political subdivision by violence, force, or other unlawful means. So it's good to know that there's that exception. You can ask people if they, I guess, put their hate group membership on their resume. I'm sure that happens a lot, and if it does, you have that out there. The penalty here is a misdemeanor and a fine between $100,000 and $5,000, and it also you can have imprisonment between 30 days and 6 months if you violate this section of the law. So here, a permissible example might be coworkers who do not have a supervisory subordinate relationship may be able to discuss their political affiliations. But an impermissible example, a supervisor questioning a subordinate's political affiliation and then suggesting it either benefits or damages them, whatever their affiliation might be with their agency. Here, a supervisor has a position of authority over the subordinate's employment. So that is how we linked it in. If there's a position where they can make a condition of your employment is where we think the link is there. Political assessment, what the law says, this one is pretty easy. We're not going to even get into any examples because it just says state offices may not be used for soliciting or collecting any political contributions. A second part of the political assessment section, employees cannot use their state positions or authority to coerce, intimidate, or influence employees for any political purpose. an example we give that could be permissible. A coworker, again, with no supervisory relationship, asks a fellow coworker if they want to attend a local political fundraiser. So there's no supervisory relationship. That might be an okay way of talking about they're not using their state positions in that example, I guess you could say. An impermissible example, a supervisor inviting a subordinate to the same fundraiser and suggesting it would be a good idea for them to attend. What's important to remember here is that coercion is in the mind of the receiver. So a subordinate may feel obligated to attend simply because of their boss's position over his or her job. The next section is prohibitions against the promise of influence. What does the law say here? Employees cannot use, whoops, on the wrong page. No state officer or employee shall corruptly use or promise to use any official authority or influence in exchange for political action on another person's part. Again, this is coming from a person who claims that they have the authority to affect a nomination, and then they coerce or persuade others to perhaps vote a certain way. Something like, I can get you that job if you vote for Mr. Smith. Before I go on, is there any questions, 107, WebEx land, or here? We're almost done with this section.
Yeah, I'd be particularly interested in hearing from officers as to either situations or scenarios or questions that you've gotten in any of your respective agencies that touch upon either activity that has raised some eyebrows or activity that has caused you some reason to sort of scratch your head and wonder whether that is something that is allowable. As so many of us sort of refer to the upcoming months as silly season, a lot of stuff happens in and out of the office, and we want to make sure that we've sort of understood the nuances in activities that you might be most familiar with. So is there anyone here, or great?
You talked about coworker to coworker equal, that you could have a discussion after a political rally. If you had someone who had like a button that supported somebody who was on the desk, and you have a coworker who's an equal and was upset with that button, whatever, whatever.
Okay.
Do you need
So
to repeat it?
we've discussed this. Yeah, I'm going to repeat it. Yes. We had a participant here who talked about what if somebody had a button, a political button, they could even be wearing it, or on their desk, and it's coworker to coworker, not necessarily any supervisory relationship, and one of them is upset about it. We've discussed this before a couple days ago. We think that at that point it gets into really a First Amendment issues, and we are not here to talk about that. We don't have jurisdiction to police something like that. Another example could be, are you listening to a political show on the radio, or do you have a Hillary or a Trump poster in your office? At that point, it becomes something that's in your private space, even though it's in your public workspace. We don't believe we have any jurisdiction to talk about those things. But when it's using state resources, or if it's that example, it's that boss saying to their subordinate, might be a good idea to come with me to this fundraiser. Those are the things we definitely, that would be 107 or 74 or some other things. So, great question. But it might be also someplace where the agency has stricter rules as well, and say, I don't know what the unions might say, but maybe your agency could say, no political buttons of anyone, period, but that you might get into some, like I said, some First Amendment issues.
Just two points, but first a quick follow-up on that. If a supervisor into the office and said, you should take that Hillary poster down because it would do you better if you weren't advocating for Hillary, for example. In other words, if the supervisor said, take it down,
I think that would fall into one of those 107 examples. The question was, what if you had a Hillary or, I'm going to be equal opportunist here today, a Hillary or a Trump or whoever you support was up on the wall, and the supervisor came in and said it'd be a good idea for you to take it down in this office, hinting to it's going to disadvantage them or advantage them one way or the other. I think that falls into, I don't know which one I was just talking about, not the one about I can get you that job, but using your state position to coerce, intimidate, or influence employees for any political purpose. That might be the place you would fit it in.
Yeah, a bit of intimidation going on there.
Just a little intimidation.
Even if the supervisor meant well by it, tried to give you some advice, that's where it starts to get sticky.
So if I could just ask my question, I
Sure.
don't know if you might be getting to this, but in political campaign season, I have been asked by others, the ethics office, whether it's permissible to campaign to canvass on behalf of a candidate. Before I opine as to what I said, can I answer?
You want to know what our opinion was?
Yes, I do.
So the question is, you have people come into your office and say, can I canvass, can I go out and campaign for a candidate? Yes, if you're not using state resources or doing it during state time. I don't think any of us are here to, again, trample on somebody's First Amendment rights to go out and support the political process the way they want to. But when it gets into the connection to your state job, if you're using state resources, going into your coworker's cube and doing the petitions, sending the petitions around there, those are things I think that are obvious that are not permissible. Did you have something?
Question and then question.
I had sort of a question about maybe some of the grayer areas, where, maybe there's the relationship between the two, two people isn't supervisor supervised, but there's maybe more of an informal hierarchy, and one person is sort of, at a higher job title, or a supervisor with someone who's not sort of their direct, their direct control, how that would interact. And then also the question of affiliation, how far beyond party affiliation does that go to sort of politically active that are not political parties. So
I'm going to take the last part of that question. I think, at least when we're talking about civil service law, it is talking about, let me go back to that, into my slides right here. We're talking about, within this particular area of the law, prohibition against certain political activities. Again, so when we talk about a political party or that candidate for the political office or the partisan political group, I do have an example later on. I think it's coming up where we talk about what if you're talking about something like the Constitutional Convention, where it's a political issue, but not necessarily tied to Dems or Republicans or Independents. So maybe if we continue on a little more, and then hopefully I'll answer most of your questions.
Okay.
And then we can kind of round up at the end.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think practically probably, my bigger question is the idea of someone where you're not a supervisor, but there's a sort of informal power dynamic.
And again, I think going back to what Megan had said earlier, the impression of whether one is being influenced or not is really held by the recipient of that message. So it's really, in the eye of the beholder as the employee with whom somebody who's not really my supervisor, but still is more senior than I and has a title that's more authoritative than mine, I might still consider that person like a supervisor and therefore still be able to enjoy the protections against political influence that I might have otherwise naturally gotten in the supervisory-supervisee relationship.
And how, and what's interesting about this is how would that play out if there was actually a court case about it? I'm not sure. When we were researching this, J-Cope itself, in the most recent 6 or 7 years of files, there's hardly anything on 107 at least. So it's not very frequently investigated, which made this researching for this a really fun job.
Okay, follow-up question from our WebEx world. Someone would like to say a little bit more about perhaps the difference between wearing a button, which is very much in your own personal space, versus having a political poster up in your state office or some literature on your state-issued desk. Doesn't that put that into more the category of misuse of state resources? You are using your state space to promote a candidate as opposed to wearing a button on your lapel, which is very much part of your own personal self.
Again, when we talked about this, there were examples. I think Aaron might have even gotten an example of somebody had a poster. Did they have a poster on their queue? Do you want to talk about that one? Yeah.
So I think this question comes up a lot, and J-Cope comes in to try to, provide some guidance, although, sometimes it is not really an ethical issue. But we had one example where an employee had a political poster in their office, and someone asked if that was okay. And, we said that maybe depending on the circumstances, that could be an issue. So can you tell me more? Maybe it's an issue if it's the front reception area, and maybe that could be an issue if, it's the first thing you see when you walk in, or, it's like sending this sort of message in this broader state space. I think there's a way for someone to have that up in their office and have that be okay. And then I think one of the distinctions that we were making too is this sort of personal versus state office space. So that clearly, if you put something up on a bulletin board in your office, that would not be okay, because that would be a use of state resources. But if it's in your office, whether it's like attached to you personally, or still sort of your same physical personal space, and I think that would that arguably could all be put together. So I think we would probably take a look at the circumstances and see if there's anything about that could present an issue. So I don't know.
Once again, ethics being gray and dependent on the totality of the circumstances.
All right, I think I'm going to move on. Let the fun continue. All right, so how does the Federal Hatch Act come into this? Federal Hatch Act restricts political activities of individuals primarily employed by state agencies in connections with programs that are financed in whole or in part by loans or grants from the U.S. government or federal agencies. And in the Federal Hatch Act, if you were in a state position that was partially or fully funded, it expressly prohibits candidacy for public office in a partisan election. An example I found back in 2009, there was an Inspector General report about an employee I'm not picking on any particular agency, but this was an employee from DEC. They had found, the IG found that they violated the Federal Hatch Act and DEC policy by campaigning for and winning 2 terms on the Kinderhook Town Board in Columbia County while they were employed in a state position partly funded by federal money. So that's out there if you wanted to. It's a quite lengthy report if you wanted to read about how that could potentially impact your agency, especially if you have lots of positions that are partially funded by federal money.
And the important takeaway is that the Hatch Act not only or not simply applies to federal jobs, but also it's a federal law that has application at the state level for state jobs that are funded with federal money.
All right, we're going to jump into Public Officers Law 73, where we're talking about business or professional activities. going to briefly touch on 7317, which is really close to, in a lot of ways, Civil Service Law 107. In 17A, we talk about political questioning in employment decisions. This section, Part A, prohibits asking an applicant during the hiring process or in other employment decisions about their political party affiliation, whether the applicant has made campaign contributions, and how they voted for how and if they voted for a particular elected official or candidate or political party. So an example here that we thought may be permissible to think about how this could play out. During an interview, the interviewer, the state employee, asks the applicant about any positions of authority. What if the applicant voluntarily disclosed a leadership role in their local Democratic Party? So at that point, this is okay because they're volunteering that information. But once you get that information for the state employee, it might not be okay to then follow up to ask more inquiries regarding this information, because then you are going into that questioning about their political affiliation, even though they volunteered it. Wise probably not to have them follow through with additional questions regarding it. So corollary to that, could an interviewer ask an applicant about their thoughts? There were, as we all know, constitutional convention was a big deal around here in an interview. So here, technically, it's not questioning a political activity or about a political party. So you can ask about certain events. I think for people doing that job, though, they have to be careful. Is it an in then to get into political questioning? So in and of itself, it's probably an okay question to ask, but be careful about going down into further political inquiries. And the obvious example, who did you vote for in the last presidential? Any local election question would be something you wouldn't be able to go into. Okay. The next question, or the next section, is B, refusal to answer political questions. Here it prohibits employees from making hiring, firing, promotional decisions based on their refusal to answer any of those questions they should be asking anyways. So an example would be a supervisor promoting, because again it could be a promotional situation, an employee with less experience over another because that person refused to disclose who they voted for in a prior election. C deals with political donations, prohibits state employees from using their authority or influence to compel or induce another employee to make certain donations. Here, we're talking about, again, these ideas of compelling or inducing, kind of along with the ideas of coercion we were talking about before. An example, supervisor sending a subordinate an email or an invitation for a political fundraiser. The key here is that there's a supervisory relationship where one person may try to use his or her authority over the subordinate. We're going to march into another area, 7-A. Relatively new, I think within the last 2 years, the bar on paid lobbying. You cannot receive payment to lobby on any proposed or pending bill or resolution in the Senate or the Assembly. So it would be okay for you as a private person to join an association's members on a lobby day. But this does not allow any state employee then to go earn any compensation as a lobbyist for a private firm. And this is a strict bar on receiving any compensation. And if any of you are involved with any of the lobbying acts in your state jobs, you would know that to register as a lobbyist, you have to meet a certain threshold to spend $5,000. And here, it doesn't matter how much you earn. It's just, you can't lobby. So for all of these sections, violations of in, I believe, Civil Service Law 107 provide for a civil penalty of up to $40,000 and the value of any gift, compensation, or benefit received, and it also can be referred to a prosecutor as well.
So again, pardon my interruption. So I'm wondering if any of you, either here or again online, have you had occasion where someone has come to you and wondered to what extent they might be able to write a letter to their state representative on a particular bill that is of concern to them? Has anyone ever asked whether they could post a comment on Facebook in opposition to a piece of state legislation or federal legislation? Does that happen in agencies? No? No here? Online? No? I'm the only one that makes this stuff up?
I'm not sure it would occur to me as a lower level employee to ask for your permission to post something on Facebook.
You just go and do it.
I would, honestly. So, I mean, it might not be so much that this doesn't occur, but that there's lack of awareness among the rank and file about where those boundaries are crossed.
Then I wonder, has anyone ever complained? Have you ever gotten a complaint about someone else posting something arguably offensive or political in nature online? No?
Not necessarily could be political in nature. Someone who was got a complaint, someone who saw somebody posting something about a supervisor who's not his supervisor, someone else's supervisor. And it was pretty discrediting to that supervisor.
So this is comment, if I'm understanding you correctly, commentary about another supervisor not having anything to do with their political interest?
Well, not obviously so.
How did it get resolved?
Well,
So just to reiterate for WebEx, one of our participants said, it may not have been political, but there was a scenario where one employee slandered a supervisor on social media, and it ultimately had to be resolved through HR. Yeah, those are ugly situations. So.
All right. We'll get into Public Officers Law 74 regarding conflicts of interest. As ethics officers, we all know this general rule. I'm not going to read it if you fall asleep. Generally, not use your position for personal benefit. This area of the law requires us to examine our activities to see if there's an actual or an appearance of conflict of interest between our public duties and our personal interests. So C is the first section we're going to talk about briefly, using confidential information. This is one that bars us from disclosing confidential information that we required and not being able to use that information to further our personal interests. So an example that could potentially happen, you provide information about a coworker's disciplinary history contained in their personnel file within your state agency for use in an opponent's campaign. We all know that that would not be okay. But I'm sure things like this happen, and so we just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, yeah. Happened in Amsterdam the other week, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or Gloversville, right?
Yeah, Gloversville, yeah. Remember, it doesn't have to be for your own personal benefit. It can be for the benefit of another person. So you may be taking this information and using it for someone who you're campaigning for. That's still a violation of public officers law. So D is the section about unwarranted privileges or misuse of state resources. All right. We've actually gotten a few really good examples that come up close to the line here, but that we told people were okay. We got a question about, there was a request to set up a table in the hallway of state building to provide information regarding the Constitutional Convention again. Here, the employees do not have special access, and it is considered a public space. So we said that there were no public officers law issues there. Also, similarly, state employees representing PAC were standing outside their office building before the workday to pass out constitutional extension materials. And there, we got more information, and we said it was permissible as the employees were not using state resources, nor were they abusing state time. They were doing it before their workday, and they were acting in their PAC capacity. Yeah, so we got a follow-up to that as well. Would a similar activity that involved the support or opposition to a specific candidate have been permissible in either location? If it's considered a public space, particularly the example of standing outside an office building, any person could drive up and hand out materials. So unless the state, I'm thinking of the state campus, unless the state campus had a general policy that prohibited anybody from doing that, then those kinds of things we thought would work. Obvious examples of what would violate Public Office Law 74, circulating a candidate's nominating petition within your office, using the computers in your office after work to produce a brochure in support of a candidate's campaign. So even though it's after work, you're still using state resources. Using your work email to send invitations to campaign events to friends within the agency would be a violation. And the last one, using New York's internet connections to forward email messages received from a partisan campaign to someone supporting, partisan campaign or someone supporting a partisan candidate. So what we tell people in the CETC.
Go.
I'm sorry.
No, you go.
Is that if you were to get an email that came to your campaign or to your state email from a campaign, don't even forward it to your personal email. The best course of action would be to call the candidate, delete the email, call the candidate or the office and say, somehow you got my work email, please forward it to my personal. That's how you avoid using any state resources, even the internet connections for that.
All right, so I wanted to stop you because I don't believe that we've got an exhaustive list of political or quasi-political activities. Is there anything else that you might sort of suggest or contribute to the conversation here that we ought to be aware of as technologies change and methods change? Are there other sorts of instances that you can think of to share with those of us here in the room with respect to questionable behavior?
Probably obvious that don't use your work issue cell phone for any of those purposes.
Not using an example also was given, not using your work issued cell phone.
Because, of course, that would be what?
State resources.
Okay.
Okay. I think we'll move on, and Erin is coming on up. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to, sorry, I will look back and forth here too. So now we're going to turn to the application of the Public Office Law 74, some other subdivisions as well, through some of our advisory opinions. So for the audience, this is always a helpful way to see how the Commission has applied the areas of law that we've been talking about. So how we're going to go through it is we focus on 3 subdivisions of 74.3, the F and H, and then as we go through them, I'll talk about different advisory opinions and how those apply, and just feel free if you have questions to chime in. So 74.3B, here that was we just talked about that was the securing unwarranted privileges using state resources section. So one of our examples here is running for office that is in conflict with your state job. And advisory opinion 9216 is a good one to look at when you're reviewing or either reviewing an outside activity or a question comes across your desk about whether or not someone can engage in running for office. And the issue in this case involves a state employee whose job duties involve leasing property for his state agency. So the inquiry there, he revolved around whether or not he could run for election as a member of their city council, and if they were to win, if they could hold that office and hold their state job. And then there's another component to that advisory where the employee asked if he could run for the Board of Education as well. But I'm not going to talk about that because that was actually okay. So you can read it if you want. So this advisory opinion looks at, as we do, we look at what does the state employee do in their state job, and then what are they looking to do, and is there any overlap? So here, just to give background because it helps with the example, the state employee's job responsibilities included identifying suitable spaces for state leases, negotiating leases, and basically they were looking at this person's involvement and interaction in their community, and this employee would have to interact with residents in their community to physically look at spaces and essentially negotiate with private landlords. And this became an issue because as his proposed elected position as a city council member, that would require those same individuals that he would be negotiating those leases with would then be his constituents who have property interests. So so in this case, the commission did decide that that there was a potential for a conflict of interest. So this is a good case for showing that the public officers law 74 in its application does not require an actual conflict of interest, but that it could, just based on the potential for it in this scenario, that that there is the potential for an appearance of a conflict, and that would be enough to render it impermissible. So I know, let me see if it's on the next slide or not. If not, I'm just going to go back. The other thing that this opinion talked about, like we do with a lot of our cases, is a recusal plan. So if you have an issue, can you remedy it? And the commission did look at, could you develop some sort of recusal plan? And what they found was that, even taking this further, if a person were to be elected, there's just no way that this person could serve in this spot because he would be recusing himself all the time. So, you can sort of, even if you see an issue in the campaign part of the process, you can still go a little bit further with the analysis and say, okay, well, let's say this person is seated and wearing both hats. What would that look like? And here they said, the matters are going to overlap so often, most likely, that this person wouldn't be able to effectively do both jobs. And that was reason enough to not grant permission. Another example that fits under 74.3D is fundraising, political fundraising. And an advisory opinion that's helpful there is 9812. And in that case, that involved former prosecutor, so it just comes out of my mouth. So this advisory opinion, there involved a state employee who was a supervisor of several units. And he came, his inquiry revolved around whether or not he could work on a political campaign of a candidate for elected office, and whether or not there were any restrictions for him engaging in this political activity. And this what came out of this advisory opinion was sort of like the standards that we look at that are cited in our JCOP approval letter that talk about, basically talk about, that the state employee can engage in the political process, that the public officers law is not meant to limit someone engaging in this process, but that there are going to be some restrictions. And the restrictions in general are that an employee may not solicit campaign contributions from any individual or business entity, which currently has matters before him, or in this case, if the matters before the unit which the person supervises, that would also fit under that. Would not be able to solicit campaign contributions from anyone who has, that they person believes has a substantial reason to believe will have matters before them in the foreseeable future, and then, or in the last 12 months. So depending on whether or not, you know, so the person that wishes to engage in this outside activity and solicit campaign contributions can do so, but have to keep in mind what individuals and entities have business before him and his unit in his state agency. So, and then this slide talks about, well, what happens if you do all of that great stuff, and then you come to find out that an individual or entity that does business with your agency or your unit has business before you or your unit contributed to the campaign that you were involved with. And this opinion talks about that and takes it a step further and says if that happens and the contribution is made within 1 year, that you would need to recuse yourself from involvement with that entity or individual to remedy that. This advisory also talks about what an employee can do with respect to mass mailing, or to say targeted versus untargeted campaign materials. So a state employee may participate in mass mailing, even if some of the letters will reach individuals or business entities from which he or she would otherwise not solicit funds. You may not engage in targeted campaign mailing. So the advisory, you know, talks about mass mailings being group, sort of the idea of group mailing. So if it's going to a group of people and the person doesn't know who it's going to get in the hands of, then that would be okay. Employee may not use his official title, position, or authority in his or her fundraising efforts or solicit from subordinates in his unit. Okay. Another good opinion, and this is the most recent one, and this goes back and captures all the other opinions too, if you want to start with this one first. Actually, I should ask, are there any questions with respect to the last section or advisory opinion? No? Okay. So 1602, this is our newer one, and it essentially, it reaffirms the precedent that you, as a state employee, you can engage in this outside activity where you can be involved in the political process with certain restrictions. And then this advisory addresses a footnote that came through the 9812, the advisory that we just talked about. And that footnote in the older advisory excluded from these restrictions any elected official who was running for re-election. And so this new advisory revisits that footnote and says that the public officers law does apply to those people who are in an elected position, who are running for re-election. And so, and the ruling in that advisory opinion was basically that they're focusing on this concept that an elected official has power and authority, depending on their title. These individuals have the power and authority to exercise discretion with respect to investigation or prosecution, that is of significance and that we should be looking at that. Because it's that discretion that leaves the potential for an appearance that there could be improper influence. So along those lines, in these elected officials that have this sort of enforcement power type of role, the decision was that a statewide elected official may not solicit or accept funds from a person or entity that is an active subject of the official's enforcement powers. And the types of things that they were looking at were, like I said, investigations and prosecutions. And so some of the examples that they gave were anyone that would be subject of an investigation, either subject of a search warrant, a subpoena, an entity where their testimony would be compelled, someone that's under, that could be audited. All those were types of examples that would clearly fall under 74, and that is something that we should be looking at. So this is another subdivision, 74-3F, and this is dealing with the appearance of a conflict in professional behavior. And I won't read it, but this is actually what F says. And it's one of the standards that, as a state employee, you can't give the impression that you can be improper. And so I'll go back to 9216 because that advisory opinion talks about a lot of different sections of 74. So 9216 touches on this subdivision as well. And what it talks about, so this is the employee who is involved in leasing for his state agency. And so what this advisory talks about is that now with this arrangement, you have this potential for individual landlords potentially, making campaign contributions to the state employee, which would create an appearance of a conflict while they're running. It could also create a conflict of interest, an appearance of a conflict of interest if the person were to be elected. And the sort of idea of, you have this appearance of if someone, contributes money towards someone's campaign, that could either affect, positively or negatively whether or not that person ended up with a lease with the state. And I think they were looking at both the all types of effects that someone's campaign contribution could have on this sort of relationship that existed here. Okay, subdivision 8, which is the standards that have to do with violation of public trust. So this is up here on the slide. And this standard is also touched on in 9216. And the commission was looking at the discussion that we had over the decisions that would affect the landlord or potential donor that he did business with. And, if you read this opinion, the state agency provided information that that the agent, from the agency's perspective, that the employee had discretion to make determinations that could result in either significant profits or losses to those who he could potentially be dealing with on both ends. So this created a whole bunch of issues, and so we're just highlighting some of the subjects.
We have a question.
Sure.
A participant on WebEx would like to know, how can an employee be discreet if their spouse becomes an elected official? Or how will they be handled? How do these laws implicate spouses?
Yeah.
Then that would be one of those questions that they would have to check in with Jacob and the team will get together to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could come up in the context of, whatever. It depends on how much that employee spouse, the state employee spouse, is involved in the process. They may not be involved all that much, and I think the same types of issues would come up, similar to this other individual working on someone else's campaign, which is can't bring it into the workplace. As much as you love your significant other, you can't. You know, there definitely has to be a filter when you're performing your state job. And I think a lot of things we talked about will probably fit depending on what that person's support for their spouse is. So you know, I don't know. I think it would depend on the circumstances. It's a good question. I'm sure it comes up. Oh yeah.
I do agree with what you said. If someone were to marry someone that's official, then that first state employee is not elected. Being an employee, so for example, would not be able to solicit contributions to the office, not be able for as a resource for political campaign, etc. I think those would sort of apply and would not change with respect to that particular state employee, regardless of the fact that they think to elected officials. With respect to the elected officials, then the state's ethics law with respect to the elected officials to apply to that individual. Right. I don't think anything would change if they were to marry.
Right. Right. No, you're right. As an audience member, you know, pointing out that state employee is bound by the public officers law before and after their significant other runs for office, and it would apply. It would apply either way. All right, I think that covers the advisory opinions. If anyone has any questions, otherwise I'll move on. I might need water. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Penalties, we always have to talk about penalties. Civil penalty of up to $10,000, any value of gift, compensation, or benefit. That's for 3D. Excuse me. And then for F and H subdivisions, there's no monetary civil penalty. There are penalties such as agency disciplinary action or other agency action. Okay, I will get into our regulations. So we have, obviously the purpose of the regulation is to effectuate the conflicts of interest provisions in the public officers law and to provide approval procedures for outside activities or policy agencies and statewide elected officials. And a lot of the language that we've been talking about, especially from the advisory opinions, they end up in our approval letters for these outside activities. We'll just go through the regulations, as some of you might already be familiar with them, but just to recap. No head of a state agency, statewide elected official, or policymaker, regardless of whether the person serves as an unpaid or per diem basis, shall serve as an officer, director, or board member of any political party or political organization. Political organization is defined in the law, and that means that it's an organization that's affiliated with a party. It does not include campaign committees or fundraising committees. No head of a state agency, statewide elected official, or policymaker, same thing with unpaid or per diem, shall serve as a member, officer, director, board member, or district leader of any party committee. And we have had some questions with that, and please feel free to call us. Sometimes we get questions say, I'm not quite sure what this is, can you help? And we do help to try to parse this out. Depending on the title, it's confusing.
And I'm sorry,
Yeah.
what's difficult often to figure out what position the person is holding in the group, or whether the group is a political organization versus a political club or the like.
Right, the latter.
Okay.
Right, whether or not, I think one inquiry I'm thinking of, the title that somebody ran for, they weren't sure if it was actually tied to, it was a position in a party. It didn't, it said so in the title, but the person's understanding of their, of what they ran for, they weren't, that's not how they perceived it. So we actually ended up getting it would look like a certificate almost of what their position was, and it fell under these restrictions. And then another example with the political organization was whether or not that would, fit our definition of political organization. So, there is some gray area to it. And some of it has to do, too, with the, as you know, layers of inquiry. So when someone comes to your office, then it comes to us. There are several people involved, and sometimes information just, we just try to piece it all together, and sometimes that's why, too. Policymakers, not including those who serve on an unpaid or per diem basis, shall obtain approval from their agency and JCOPE prior to holding elected office or appointed public office, regardless of compensation. And we do, as you guys probably already know this, but we do, field inquiries when someone's thinking about running for something, or, there are all different points in this process, and people want to make sure that when they jump into something, perhaps financially or otherwise, that it's okay to do. So that's okay too. Even if it feels a little premature, feel free to reach out to us. We have, worked through that as well. It does make sense, and I would imagine an employee would want to know whether or not they want to engage in it prior to starting. And this, we thought we'd touch on agency-specific rules in addition to our regulations and all the other things that we've discussed, because it does, we have found that agencies do have their own sets of rules, and that there are things that come up here, or, as inquiries arise, agencies might take those inquiries or complaints as an opportunity to amend or adopt their own new rules with respect to political restrictions. So we do know that we have restrictions that are stricter than the ones we've talked about today. There can be stricter policies beyond state agencies, including public authorities. We just gave an example here of an executive order. And I think that, I can't remember that one, but there is, and I'll just touch on this, I'm not sure. Maybe that's what it was, executive number two. There was one of the examples that, a couple examples that we found. One was that the executive chamber, through this executive order that's been continued over a couple governors, limit the campaign contributions that employees can make to the governor's office. And I believe also that the Office of the State Comptroller has a similar restriction on that agency's political contributions to the state comptroller's campaign. So, so that's something that agencies can take a look at too. These are other examples of policies that that could be affected by someone's involvement in the political process. Charging leave time, coordinating schedules between staff and campaign staff, press inquiries, and again, campaign contributions. And that's it. If anyone has any questions.
In the situation where a employee, as an example, would use their email to forward some political campaign material, and an agent finds out, either what the situation calls for, either counsels or disciplines an employee, is there any requirement, and I guess I'm thinking of the executive law, about reporting that kind of abuse to the Inspector General, and then I look at the posters here, report misconduct, should the agencies also report that to JCOPE, or is, what do agency ethics officers do in a situation like that?
So that's a great question. I'll repeat it in case I don't know if they can hear on the microphone. There's a question in the audience about, what should agency ethics officers or anyone in the agency setting be thinking about in terms of reporting or referring any issues to JCOPE. My understanding, there's no requirement. We encourage agencies to reach out to us like, when you get a complaint or even when you hear of something at any point in the process, we are, we're in sort of a position where we get all kinds of inquiries, and maybe we had something similar to that, and we can provide you with that type of information. Or maybe it's something more serious that should come to us and should be looked at from our investigation standpoint. So really it would depend on what the circumstance is. But I think either way, we have jurisdiction over enforcing and interpreting this area of the law. So if for nothing else other than to get another, sort of set of eyes and feedback from us, would be helpful.
Yeah, let me jump in here. Our jurisdiction is not exclusive, so even if a complaint were made to the Inspector General or any other prosecutor, for example, it doesn't relieve JCOPE of both the interest and the responsibility in checking things out as well. We are all about trying to change, as you are, all about trying to change the culture. And if it means blowing the whistle every day of the year, then we are here, H-E-R-E, to hear, H-E-A-R, that whistle. So I would encourage calls, complaints, and complaint may be too strong a word, but I would encourage from anyone at any time a call to us to at least give us some sense of some problematic behavior that may be going on in the agency, so that we can either work with the agency in addressing the situation or issue guidance and corrective actions where and when necessary.
Just to add to that quickly, I mean, we have, I think, a really good group of attorneys here right now, not to toot our own horn, but we all come from different backgrounds. I was at the Comptroller's office. Aaron came from Medicaid Inspector General's office and Albany DA. I'm going to give her a bio. And then Keith has come from the Senate. And so we all are coming from all these different areas. And so I always joke, I said, I'm attorney of the day on Monday, so call Tuesday through Friday. But that's what we're here for, and to listen and to be our resource. And again, why we hold these forums, because we want to see you, we want to talk to you, we want to hear what's going on.
I'll shoot your horn, because I have called often and many times, and every time I've gotten really good advice, really good response, and from all of you. So I just want to say thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Who's been quiet? I'm looking at you.
It could just be political exhaustion.
The weather.
No other questions via WebEx?
All right.
With that, thank you.
Oh,
wait.
Yes.
Open the reg and that there are no sort of general motivations that make political
Right. So there are no general prohibitions to making political contributions. Again, unless you're covered by maybe an executive order of
or your agency.
appointees making certain contributions, but other than those, no. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Until the next one.